is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Sunday, September the 10th, 2023. Earlier today, an interesting show with an American writer, Michael Harriot, on how he discovered America at 8 p.m. He knows the exact time on November the 4th, 1980. This is the introduction to his new book, Black AF History, the Unwhitewashed Story of America. That was the moment a young Michael Harriot recognized that Ronald Reagan had been elected the 40th president of the United States, and talked to Harriot about Reagan's policy on race, his Southern strategy, and of course we touched inevitably on Richard Nixon and Reagan's ideological debt, if that's the right word, to Nixon. We've done lots of shows, of course, on Richard Nixon, the most controversial American politician probably in history, certainly in the 20th century. Did one with Kevin Boyle, who believes that America remains haunted by Richard Nixon's paranoia, particularly his cultural paranoia. Boyle, who teaches at Northwestern University in Chicago, has a very influential book, The Shattering America in the 60s. Boyle, of course, is no great fan of Richard Nixon. But we have had some Nixon defenders on the show. Last year we had Dwight Chapin, who actually went to jail for Richard Nixon, doesn't seem to regret it. He had a book out, The President's Man, The Memoirs of Nixon's Trusted Aide. Nixon, of course, he's been dead for a while, but he won't die in intellectual terms. And today we're back with Nixon, a different take on it by my guest, Paul Carter. He has an interesting new book, Richard Nixon, California's Native Son, and he's joining us from his law office in Long Beach, California. Paul, welcome and congratulations on the new book. Before we get to its themes, you tend to, I think, be a little bit more in the Dwight Chapin camp, although you didn't go to jail for Richard Nixon. In broad terms, though, with Watergate and, of course, Nixon's Southern strategy and the dog whistling that seems to have metastasized into Donald Trump, do you really think that Richard Nixon deserves a second or third chance?
Absolutely. And first, thank you for having me here today. There are so many misconceptions about Richard Nixon, and even, referencing like the dog whistle or the Southern strategy. And so much of it is premised on this misunderstanding as to what Richard Nixon's youth was really all about and what he was like as a person. And that is what is really explored in my book. I cover in great detail, quite frankly, his all-American life growing up in Southern California, and quite the opposite of being bold or having a chip on his shoulder. I mean, not bold, but insecure or having a chip on his shoulder. He was quite bold and quite confident and quite successful, and really the opposite of the image that's been propagated about him that is vested into the American culture. And to me, the question becomes, is Richard Nixon a villain that got his just desserts, or was he an all-American person that really had a truly successful and all-American life? And that's what my book explores.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Paul, whether one can't have it both ways. I mean, I just reread Rick Perlstein's Nixonland, very influential book. Perlstein's been on the show talking about his book Reaganland. I need to get him back actually to talk about Nixonland. I don't think Perlstein would disagree with some of what you said. I mean, clearly Richard Nixon was a remarkably smart man. He was, whatever he was, top of his law school at Duke, worked incredibly hard, amazingly smart, dedicated, focused. There's no doubt about that. But it's the moral issues, of course, that are so controversial. Are you arguing that you don't think that Richard Nixon was profoundly morally flawed?
He was not profoundly morally flawed. He was no more flawed than anybody else.
I know. Well, that's a rather I mean, no more than, I don't know, Jimmy Carter or Gerald Ford. I mean, most people, most people seem at least to be less morally flawed. In what sense do you mean that?
Well, take a look at what he did. And rather than looking at it and coming to the conclusion that he's a crook, if you take a look at what he did, you come away from it and you look at it and you say he was fundamentally honest. You know, look at the Watergate, the tapes, for example. Everybody told him destroy the tapes. He knew what was on the tapes. He said no. Even his wife told him to burn the tapes on the White House lawn, and he said no, and he preserved those tapes. And when the tapes were ultimately ruled on by the court to give them up, and he could have destroyed them before they were subpoenaed and before they were subject to the subpoena, and he would have been within his rights. And he said no, and he kept them, and then he turned them over, knowing what was on them. And that's fundamental honesty. If you look at the politicians since, look at how many politicians have deleted emails or their devices on which emails are served.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure this is the right. I mean, especially since your book really isn't about Watergate.
Right.
And I guess I asked the question in the first place, but it's such a complicated story, and certainly the fact that he didn't destroy the tapes doesn't give him some sort of moral pass. I mean, there were many other issues associated with what he did in association with those tapes. I'm curious. I'm curious, Paul. Do you remember? I mean, I'm not sure how old you were. When were you born?
I was born in 1965. And
so for you, Richard Nixon is essentially just a memory. What is it about Nixon that, you know, Chapin was on the show. He worked for Nixon, so I can understand his passionate defense. But what is it about Nixon that makes you so passionate? Why have you written a book? Why have you dedicated some of your intellectual life to Nixon?
Well, you're right. I don't have a stake in the whole Richard Nixon legacy. I wasn't alive during. Well, I was alive during the '60s, but you know, I was just a child. My earliest memory of Richard Nixon was when I was 9 years old, and he came. My father came home early from work and told me to come inside and watch the president resign. And I'm a product of public school education, and I basically thought everything about Richard Nixon that most everyone else has thought about him. That you know, he was wrong, and he was probably ornery and devious. And I was in the Navy in the 1980s. Coincidentally, my commanding officer was one of the longest held POWs and most extensively tortured. His name was Rodney Allen Knudsen, and Richard Nixon brought him home. And my commanding officer inspired me to go to college and to follow my dream of being an attorney. And so while I was at Cal State Fullerton, my mom recommended that I volunteer as a docent at the Richard Nixon Library. And I did, and I ended up meeting Richard Nixon. And in meeting him, that dichotomy between what he was really like and what his public image was, and even my perceptions of what he was going to be like, really stuck with me. And fast forward almost 20 years later, and I reconnected with a couple of people from my Navy service, and I ended up going out and spending the day with a companion officer of a guided missile cruiser off the coast of California, and the mayor of Whittier was with us. And he had
and Whittier, of course, is where Nixon grew up in California.
Right. And so I kind of offhanded just asked him, you know, do you have all the places where Nixon was born and raised designated or, you know, landmarked or whatever? And he said, no, they kind of forgot about all of it. And I just thought to myself, you know, he's the president of the United States. I'm going to make a map of his Southern California life. And in doing that, I discovered that there was oral histories at Cal State Fullerton, my alma mater. They had about 200 oral histories from Richard Nixon's intimates and friends and colleagues from his youth. And what I really wanted to know was, you know, where was the soda fountain at that Nixon went to when he was at Whittier College? And you know, where did the kids go out on, you know, for dates, and what did they do? And I started reading those oral histories, and then I got another 400 oral histories from Whittier College of the Nixon intimates and people from Whittier. And that was over 10,000 pages. And what really struck me was the person that emerged in those oral histories was really similar to that person that I met when I met Richard Nixon working at his presidential library. And it really, screamed out to me to write a book about what he was really like in his youth. Very, very successful, very confident, very, very well liked. He was considered to be best man on campus when he was at Whittier College. When he was graduating Whittier College, his classmates, the athletes on campus, wrote him a letter, and they said that out of every graduating class, one person always becomes a great person, and we all believe that you're destined to be that.
So you would reject the Pearlstein argument, and Pearlstein developed this. I'm sure many others have followed it. I guess in a way, Boyle also follows it. That Nixon was always haunted by demons. He always had huge cultural and social chips on his shoulder. He was always angry against the Eastern establishment and the people in power, and that his childhood was challenging at best. You think that he was a well-rounded, happy-go-lucky kind of fellow?
Absolutely. Always very serious, but absolutely. He was 8th grade class president at Fullerton High School in his first 2 years. Well, going back to 8th grade.
So, but I take your point. But so, what would you say to? What do you make of the Pearlstein argument that's become sort of pretty much accepted? Did Pearlstein make it up?
No, but historians seem to be very similar to attorneys, and we don't relitigate every case. We take precedent, and we don't reinvestigate every prior case. We build on each case as precedent. And if you look at the primary source biographies about Richard Nixon, they all came out after he resigned, and they were really psychohistorians. Fawn Brodie was the leader of that. She admits she despised Richard Nixon, and she is the one that developed that theory about him having a chip on his shoulder. And she cites to some of the oral histories at Cal State Fullerton. It's my position that she really cherry-picked the positions and misrepresented them. And if you actually go back and read those oral histories, and I've cited them voluminously in my book, I have over 200 pages of footnotes, because I'm not here to really say anything about Richard Nixon other than what the evidence says about Richard Nixon. And if you don't believe what I say, take a look and just go look at the source material. It's available to everybody.
Yeah, and to be fair, your book is not really an attempt to, so to speak, whitewash Nixon. I mean, and I want to talk about the Californian themes later. But there's clearly it's impossible to write about Nixon without some sort of moral dimension. If you're going to write a positive biography, then implicitly, at least, you are forgiving him, perhaps, or simply refusing to acknowledge any guilt. So are you saying that he wasn't a paranoid man? I mean, behind Watergate, whether or not Watergate was a terrible sin, there was certainly a degree of paranoia, and the tapes reveal that. A man who saw enemies everywhere. I mean, that's not typical of all politicians, certainly not even of Reagan.
I don't know about seeing enemies everywhere, but it seems to me that every president is pretty well aware of who their detractors and their enemies are. And you see that, probably every president since Nixon, you see them kick off different news media off their Air Force One or reject White House passes and do similar things that would be tantamount to an enemies list. I don't think that that's any really new thing, but no, I don't see that Richard Nixon at all was paranoid.
Ironically, Paul, in a way, your attempt to sort of normalize him and say, well, he had a happy childhood and he was loved and he went to the soda fountain, you're making him, in historical terms, a less interesting figure. You're turning him into Harry Truman.
Well, but he really was, he's a human being. And that's really what my point is.
Well, I mean, the fact that he's a human being doesn't tell us anything one way or the other. I mean, there's no one's ever argued that he wasn't a human being.
But if you look at his history in Southern California, it's really interesting because, one issue that people say is, well, he was a Quaker that went to war. Well, so was Nathaniel Greene that was in George Washington's Revolutionary Army. And if you look in Whittier, you have Whittier proper, and then you have East Whittier. And there's the Whittier Friends Church, and there's the East Whittier Friends Church. The East Whittier Friends Church, where Richard Nixon was a member, almost all the men that were Quakers joined the war effort in World War II. Even the most liberal of them, one of whom was a gentleman by the name of Merton Ray, whose father had almost been elected governor of Nebraska. He even said once the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the time for talk was over. But then if you look at the Whittier First Friends Church, almost none of those men joined the service. And so he was really a product of his community, and what he did was not unusual in his community. And that's really what I'm bringing out. And I'm saying, take a look at his individual community. If you look at him in terms of, people saying that he had a chip on his shoulder, actually in the East Whittier community where he grew up, his father was quite successful. And his family even bought what was known as the Studi Estate in 1939 in the hills above Whittier College. And they ended up moving out of it by about 1943 because for Hannah Nixon, she felt that the house was too ostentatious. And, when Richard Nixon was going to college at Whittier, it was in the heart of the Depression. And the teachers were being paid in land in some instances because everyone was so broke. The students couldn't afford a 10-cent tamale. Yet Richard Nixon was one of the 6 people in the university that owned a car. And, wages back then were about 30 cents an hour, and he paid $300 for his car. And so you would figure that would take about 6 months of nonstop work and nonstop saving just to get that money. And that's not the impression anyone has of him, but that's the reality.
Well, I don't know. I don't know anyone would doubt that Richard Nixon was an intensely hardworking man. Anyway, we are talking with Paul Carter, who is a brave man. He's written a sympathetic biography of Richard Nixon called California's Native Son. I want to take a break now, Paul. Afterwards, I want to talk specifically about the thesis of your book about Nixon and California, which I think is in some ways quite interesting. I mean, we can't keep on really litigating Nixon. I've made it clear where I stand. You've made it clear where you stand. After the break, though, I want to talk about Nixon as a Californian, as a politician, president, man. But I want to remind our listeners that this show is brought to you by Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics, very open-minded, hopefully like this show. And I'm going to run a short ad for Liberties, and then we'll be back with Paul Carter to talk Richard Nixon. So don't go away, anyone.
Beyond the news, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
You can check out more about Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We are talking with Paul Carter, the author of an interesting new book on Richard Nixon. I'm not sure we need another book, but they keep on coming. Richard Nixon, California's Native Son. We're talking at a time, of course, where there is some possibility that Gavin Newsom will run for president. If Joe Biden decides he doesn't want to run, Gavin Newsom is born and bred Californian. He's been on the show several times, Northern Californian. Well, Paul Carter's new book is premised on the thesis that that Richard Nixon is California's only native son president. What does that say, Paul? Why is that an interesting fact?
If you look at the history of the country and the development of our country, it developed through the Northeast, and all of, the whole area that's considered the Northeastern establishment, made up of the 13 original colonies. That's where all the Ivy League schools are within. And then all of the political leaders and the presidents came within that area. And then it slowly began to migrate out and south and to the West. And by about the time Richard Nixon came along, really the furthest national politicians that you really had of great prominence were just barely west of the Mississippi. And you have Richard Nixon and his family Well, you have Richard Nixon coming onto national prominence in the late 1940s, and he's a product of a family that gave up their life in the Northeast and the Midwest, and they went across the Great Plains, they went across the Rocky Mountains, and they came to Southern California in the late 1800s and the early 1900s at a time when travel wasn't easy and there were no promises out here, and it took a lot of great risk to do that. And it's this rugged individualism and the self-reliance that his family really had. And he is the first and only native-born Californian to become the president. And he had that rugged individualism about him. And he had that Western ideology that a lot of people attribute to Ronald Reagan. In fact, if you look at Ronald Reagan, he was a Truman Democrat. And in the period between 1948, when Ronald Reagan was a Truman Democrat, in California, you had Richard Nixon as the vice president. You had Earl Warren, who was the governor of California that became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. You had Goodwin Knight that succeeded Earl Warren to the governorship. And then you had Bill Nolan, who was the senator from California. And throughout the 1950s, Earl Warren went to the Supreme Court, and then Bill Nolan decided to run against Goodwin Knight for the governorship in 1958. So Goodwin Knight ran for Nolan's Senate seat, and they both lost. And you had Richard Nixon really as the last Californian standing as a prominent politician, and he's working with Ronald Reagan. And by 1964, Ronald Reagan, becomes a Republican, and it's really subscribing to those Jeffersonian principles that Richard Nixon had, which were limited government and fiscal responsibility, and that open spaces type of leadership that Richard Nixon really believed in from being a Southern Californian and growing up out here where, we had open spaces and clean oceans, and he was by the beach. In his 1970 State of the Union address, he said that clean air, clean water, open spaces, should be a birthright of every American. And that was because of his youthful experience growing up in Southern California.
What about his lifelong anti-communism, of course, that brought him to national prominence in the 1950s? Is that somehow associated with his Californian upbringing?
Absolutely. In the elementary school years, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, he started going into debate. And by his freshman and sophomore year in high school, he was winning the constitutional oratorical contest put on by the Los Angeles Times. During those years, he came to determine that the United States Constitution was the finest document ever struck by the hand of men. And he was really devoted to democracy. And then he went off to World War II, and he actually served in the South Pacific in combat. No U.S. president's ever been a Marine, but Richard Nixon is the only United States president that served with a Marine Corps combat unit in war. And he received a letter of commendation for his combat service. And so he knew what the difficulties of war fighting. And then he went to Europe as a freshman congressman with the Herter Commission, and he saw the ravages of post-World War II Europe and the communist influences that were taking place in trying to become in strongholds in places such as Italy. And it really solidified his belief with his lifelong dedication to the Constitution and democracy of the need to fight those influences. And it really solidified in him that belief, which he had a lifelong dedication to fight.
Critics of Nixon will suggest it's one thing not to be a communist, it's another to be rather paranoid about communism, McCarthyism, that Nixon inflamed the paranoia about anti-communism in America. Is there no truth to that? And is that somehow associated with his Southern Californian roots, which historically, of course, was quite conservative? It's very different today.
Well, Richard Nixon really wasn't paranoid about communism. You have to remember that in 1959, he went to Russia, and he had the kitchen debate with Khrushchev, and had extensive meetings with Khrushchev. And Richard Nixon was never one that believed in outlying communism. He believed that communism should be taught in schools in our country. He believed that it's something you have to understand to know to be against
it. But in the context, he may not have been paranoid about Russian or Chinese communism, but he was paranoid, I think, about the threat of communism internally. He was very, very close to J. Edgar Hoover. I think he was, of all American politicians, he was the closest to Hoover, given his enormously long career. And he was very much associated with a lot of the witch hunts against communists within America.
Actually, if you look at that, he was on the House Un-Americans committee, which was the committee that did all the blacklisting in Hollywood, and he's never been associated with doing the blacklisting. He's always been associated with being the person that was actually fair about the way he conducted his investigations. And so I would say the evidence demonstrates the opposite.
He was, of course, he came to national prominence in the Alger Hiss case. Yeah, you're right. Of course, he was politically savvy enough to separate himself from Joe McCarthy. Paul, let's get back to California. The California of the 50s and 60s was a politically quite different place. How would you make sense of that? What's happened in California? Is this in part a consequence of Nixon? Why is California now perhaps the most democratic state, when in Nixon's time it was solidly Republican?
You know, actually, in Nixon's time, California was always had a majority of Democrats. The voter registration,
Southern California at least.
Well, no, even 1962, when he ran for governorship of California, the voting or the voter registration was much. It was over 1 million more voters in favor of the Democrats, and the only way Richard Nixon could have won that election is if he would have united every single solitary Republican and then gotten upwards of 1 million Democrats to vote for him. Otherwise, just mathematically, it's not possible. And if you look at Richard Nixon and you think about, was he paranoid and morally corrupt and flawed? In that election, one of the big issues was the John Birch Society. And the John Birch Society had been against Eisenhower, and Richard Nixon refused to kowtow to the John Birch Society, and he refused to back any candidates that wouldn't denounce the John Birch Society. And he did that knowing that would not unite the entire Republican Party, which basically meant he lost the election.
What about the issue of race? I'm not claiming that Richard Nixon was a racist, and that's not really the issue. But with Michael Harriot, for example, this morning, the Southern strategy, the increasingly white nature of the Republican Party, surely Nixon started that. Doesn't he have any responsibility?
What was the Southern strategy would be my first question, because
the Southern strategy was to recognize that there was a strategic opportunity in the early to mid 60s for the Republican Party to win the support of the white South, which tended to be racist and nostalgic for a very different kind of segregated world.
Well, Richard Nixon didn't win any more of the South in 1968 than President Eisenhower won in 1952 and 1956. And it doesn't appear that he really conducted any more of a campaign in the South other than to try and hold what Eisenhower won. And if you think of like a racist Southern strategy, look at desegregation. It's actually the quite opposite, because when Richard Nixon became president, which was almost 15 years after Brown versus Board of Education was decided, and almost nothing was done to desegregate Southern schools in those years between Brown versus Board of Education in 1968. And Richard Nixon took office, and less than 10% of Southern schools were desegregated. And what Richard Nixon told his staff was, we're not going to poke our fingers in their eyes. We're not going to, rub their noses in it. We're not going to get our names in the newspapers, but we're going to do this, and we're going to desegregate this. And they did. And by the time he left office, the vast majority of schools were desegregated. And if you believe in this whole concept of a Southern strategy and attracting the racist votes, wouldn't that just piss off all the Southern racists, then have them vote against you in 72? It seems like the exact contrary thing to do if you believed in this whole concept of a Southern strategy.
Where do you think Nixon would be today politically? Would he be comfortable within the Republican Party? Would he be or a conservative perhaps within the Democratic Party?
Well, Andrew, let me tell you, first of all, the difference between his intellect and my intellect would fill the Grand Canyon. And I'm not going to presuppose to say what he would do about anything. But I think that he always stuck to principles. You know, he was a Jeffersonian Republican, limited government, fiscal responsibility, and he wasn't a populist. And I think that's the big difference between when Richard Nixon was in office and now, where this whole populism has sprouted up. You know, look at where we are today and all of the hostility, and everyone says we have a fractured country and we're divided.
Well, you're sidestepping the question here. Would he be sympathetic, say, to Mitt Romney? Would he be on that wing? It's a fairly unpopulated wing now of the Republican Party. Would he be comfortable with a Romney?
It's hard for me to say one way or the other what I can't really pick a person out of time and put him into another time period and say this or that would take place. My point would be to look at the way that he conducted himself, and if he were alive, I think he would be conducting himself and in that same manner, which probably wouldn't lead to some of the same problems. And because in 1968 the country was tremendously fractured. Robert Kennedy was assassinated, Martin Luther King was assassinated, Johnson couldn't even run for re-election. It was so hostile. And then we had Richard Nixon, and what did he do? He came in and he reached across the aisle. He didn't bring in partisanship. He brought in people, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Leon Panetta.
I think that could be subject of another show, Paul. That's
but my point is that he would work with people because he wanted to administer and get things done.
You focus on the personal side of Nixon as a son, a brother, a friend, husband, father, uncle, grandfather. I'm sure he was in some ways a decent man, but was he really a good husband? Didn't he treat his wife as if she was essentially just an accessory?
No, Pat was, if you look at the letters between Richard and Pat Nixon, and if you look at the letters, letters are really revealing, because that's when you write something to a friend or a colleague of yours, you're really revealing yourself and kind of letting your hair down. And he just did everything for Pat and deferred to her in so many ways that aren't recognized.
Is there anything that you've done a lot of research on Nixon? Clearly you're a fan. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But is there anything that you read or found that disturbed you about the man?
I think most everything that I read about him really was surprising in how much of a regular guy he was in terms of being, charitable. If you wrote him a letter, he'd write you back. If you asked him what he thought about something, he'd write you back and tell you. He would do things and have these relationships with people that were just astounding. And, look at the women in Richard Nixon's life. You brought up Pat.
Pat wrote the intro. No, Tricia Nixon wrote the intro to your book, or the foreword.
Right. But if you look at, I always tell people that the best judge of a man is a woman. Evelyn Dorn was Richard Nixon's first legal secretary in 1937. She was dedicated to Richard Nixon her entire life. Loie Gaunt was in his Senate office, and she stayed on with the Nixons their entire lives, and she passed away after they did. Marge Acker just died 2 weeks ago. She was part of the Nixon Senate office, and she worked for the Nixons her entire life. All of these women, if he was this morally corrupt, evil, insecure, paranoid person, all of these women would not dedicate their lives to him and be proud of the fact of doing it, because they were all good and decent women. And all of them to a T were dedicated to Richard Nixon. And, you talk about Pat would get mad at him because he would do things that were political, like she really wanted him to nominate a female to the United States Supreme Court. And he wanted to nominate Mildred Lilly, who was a justice on the California Court of Appeal, to the Supreme Court. but the American Bar Association voted, you know, the all male committee voted 11-1 that she was unqualified. Yet she was the longest serving justice in the state of California, and she was a Democrat, by the way. Granted, she was too conservative for Pat Brown to nominate to the state Supreme Court from the Court of Appeal. And I'm not saying that she was a liberal Democrat, but you know, I saw things like that.
Is there a Nixonian tradition? Is there someone you look up to in a contemporary American politics that reminds you of Richard Nixon?
I would say very pragmatic politicians would remind me
like
of Richard
who?
Nixon.
Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton was very pragmatic. He would be somebody that I would say would be like Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was different because he was an introvert in an extrovert's profession, and he wasn't looking for the adulation that so many politicians strive for. You know, he was seeking accomplishment in what he was doing, which really is an interesting thing in politics.
So how should we remember him? Are you suggesting that he everyone's got him wrong, that he should be remembered as a cheerful, all-American apple pie boy from Southern California, from a happy family who led a happy life and was persecuted unjustly?
He was an incredible All-American. He had ups and downs. You know, like Tricia said that she loved her father through all seasons, and I think that was the way I would describe him. That nobody's perfect, but he was not our darkest president, and he was certainly not our most flawed president.
And he was a happy. You're suggesting that he was a happy-go-lucky kind of guy?
I don't know. I mean, there's no doubt he was serious. But he was the type of person that had very wonderful and genuine relationships with people. You know,
well, no one's doubting. No one would argue against that. I mean, you're undermining actually the vague affection I have for him, which is this deeply flawed but very ambitious and talented man. You're suggesting that he wasn't flawed. You've made him boring, I think, Paul.
I'm not saying he was not flawed. I'm saying he was not deeply flawed. I think everyone is flawed.
Now that's illegal. That's like that's a Clintonian legal defense. He was flawed, but not deeply flawed. Well, you're a brave man, Paul Carter, to defend a man who most people won't. But you're brave enough to write a book about him. Congratulations on the new book, Richard Nixon, California's Native Son. Interesting book about the Californian roots of Richard Nixon. And we'll have to see, Paul. He's with Trump, Nixon looks increasingly decent. We'll have to see what happens in the next few years. Thank you so much.